"She's merely a dowry to me," the Duke said to his mistress, unaware she stood right behind him. The library at Crimson Manor was the sort of room that swallowed sound. Heavy velvet drapes covered the tall windows. Candles burned in low clusters along the mantelpiece, throwing amber light across the shelves of books that no one had touched in years. It was a room built for privacy, for quiet conversations that were never meant to leave its walls. Which was, Clara Montgomery reflected, deeply unfortunate for the man currently speaking inside it. She had not meant to overhear. She had arrived at Crimson Manor only that afternoon, escorted by her father and his solicitor for the formal introduction to her future husband. The butler had shown her to the drawing room, offered tea, and then disappeared entirely for 25 minutes. Clara, who had never been good at sitting still when there was a house to explore, had followed the sound of voices down the east corridor, mostly out of curiosity and partly because she had a lemon tart from the tea tray and nowhere else to be. She had pushed open the heavy library door only an inch before she heard the words. "She is merely a moving dowry to me, darling." The voice was smooth, unhurried, and deeply bored. "A necessary transaction to satisfy my mother's wretched inheritance clause. Once the ring is on her finger, she can rot in the countryside for all I care. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden beauty and unexpected love, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories where pain shatters and true character shines through. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and your presence makes these stories come alive." Clara stopped. Through the narrow gap in the door, she could see the speaker clearly. Julian Vance, the Duke of Penrose, was standing at the sideboard with his back partly to her, pouring brandy from a crystal decanter. He was tall, with the particular careless elegance of a man who had never had to try very hard at anything. His dark coat sat perfectly across his shoulders. His profile, lit by the candles, was the kind that portrait painters requested. Beside him, draped across the leather armchair with the comfort of someone who had occupied it many times before, was a woman in a silk gown the color of deep water. Lady Penelope. Clara did not know her surname, but she had heard the name mentioned in exactly the kind of whisper that told you everything was beautiful in the deliberate, constructed way of a woman who considered beauty a professional skill. She was smiling at Julian with the fond exasperation of someone who had heard this sort of thing before. "Poor creature," Lady Penelope said, lifting her glass. "Does she know what she is walking into?" "She knows what her father arranged on her behalf," Julian said, without particular interest. "A title, a settlement, and the satisfaction of telling her neighbors she married a duke. That is generally sufficient for these arrangements." Clara looked down at the lemon tart in her hand. She considered, for a moment, what the expected response to this situation was. She could feel it, the way you can sometimes feel the shape of a room in the dark, the tearful entrance, the wounded declaration, the dramatic exit. The story that she was supposed to perform, right here in this doorway. She took a slow, deliberate bite of the tart instead. The crunch was extremely audible in the quiet room. Julian went still. It was the stillness of a man whose mind had just caught up with a very large and very immediate problem. He turned around slowly, in the way that people turn around when they are hoping that if they move carefully enough, reality might rearrange itself before they have to face it. Clara looked back at him, chewing. Lady Penelope made a sharp sound that was not quite a gasp and sat upright in the armchair, smoothing her skirts with the automatic composure of a woman who had survived difficult social situations before. Her eyes moved from Clara to Julian and back again, calculating rapidly, waiting for the breakdown. Clara finished chewing. She dusted a small pastry crumb from her sleeve with 2 neat fingers. The Duke of Penrose was staring at her with an expression she had not seen on a person's face before, something that was equal parts horror, embarrassment, and the particular blankness of a man who had prepared for every outcome except this one. She looked at him steadily. "Do finish your drink, Your Grace," she said. "We have a guest list to finalize, and I assure you, my countryside cottage requires a very large budget if I am to rot there comfortably." The silence that followed was the most satisfying silence Clara had ever produced. Julian's mouth opened slightly. Then it closed. The hand holding the brandy glass did not move. Behind him, Lady Penelope was staring with an expression that Clara recognized as involuntary respect fighting very hard against its better instincts. Clara looked around the room with the mild, appraising look she used on unfamiliar markets and complicated botanical specimens. The library was impressive, genuinely impressive, ceiling to floor in leather-bound volumes, a globe near the window, a writing desk of serious old mahogany. It was the kind of room that could have been wonderful if it had any warmth in it at all. "The library is beautiful," she said conversationally, stepping fully through the door. "I was told it was the finest in the county. I can see why." She glanced at the shelves nearest the door. "You have a first edition Culper here. That is remarkable." She looked back at Julian, who had still not entirely recovered his color. "I will need access to this room. For the botanical research, primarily, but also because the drawing room has very poor light in the afternoon and I find it difficult to read there." Julian set his glass down carefully on the sideboard. "Lady Penelope," he said, his voice recovered to something approaching its usual register, "I believe you were just leaving." Lady Penelope stood, shaking out her silk skirts, and crossed the room with perfect composure. She paused at the door beside Clara, and for a moment the two women were level. Lady Penelope looked at her with the specific attention of someone reassessing a situation they thought they had fully understood. "Good luck, Miss Montgomery," she said. It was not entirely unfriendly. "Thank you," Clara said. "I find I don't need very much of it, but it's kind of you to offer." Lady Penelope left. The door closed behind her. Clara and Julian stood in the candlelit library alone for the first time. He looked at her. She looked at him. She had been told he was handsome, and this was accurate in the same way that a winter landscape could be called handsome, striking, composed, and entirely without warmth. "I owe you," he started. "An apology," Clara said. "Yes, probably. But I don't think you are quite ready to mean one yet, and I would rather have a sincere apology in a week than a convenient one in the next 30 seconds. She looked at the Culper again. "Shall we speak in the morning? I have had rather a long journey, and I think better when I have slept." Julian stared at her for a long moment. "The housekeeper will show you to your room," he said finally. "I already found it," Clara said. "Third door on the left at the top of the east staircase. The housekeeper showed me when I arrived." She picked up the last of the lemon tart. "Good night, Your Grace. Try not to look so alarmed. I suspect this will all be considerably less catastrophic than it appears at this particular moment." She left him standing alone in his beautiful, empty library, with a glass of unfinished brandy on the sideboard and the distinct feeling that something had changed in a way he could not yet name. Chapter 2. Julian Vance was not accustomed to being managed. He was a duke. He had managed solicitors, estate managers, parliamentary committees, and a mother who could reduce cabinet ministers to apology. He was 29 years old and had spent the last decade arranging the world to his precise specifications. He did not get managed. He did the managing. And yet, somehow, by 9 o'clock the following morning, Clara Montgomery was sitting at his desk. Not in one of the chairs positioned in front of the desk, where visitors were received. At the desk itself, in his chair, with 3 of his ledgers open in front of her and a cup of tea at her elbow. She had also moved his paperweight, a heavy brass lion that had sat in the same position for 6 years, to the left side of the blotter, apparently because it was blocking the light. Julian stopped in the doorway and looked at this scene for a moment. "Good morning," Clara said, without looking up from the ledger. "Your grain purchasing contracts have not been renegotiated since 1848. The current rates are approximately 14% above the regional market average. I noticed because your estate records from that year are sitting in the lower left drawer and I was curious." "You went through my drawers," Julian said. "The lower left drawer was slightly open," she said. "I am a botanist. I notice things." She turned a page. "Also, your tenant correspondence is 3 months behind. That will cause problems come winter if you need emergency repairs authorized." Julian crossed the room, reached past her, and closed the ledger with a deliberate snap. Clara looked up at him with an expression of mild patience. He returned it with the expression he used in parliamentary debates and board meetings, cool, authoritative, designed to communicate that the conversation was moving in his direction now. "I called you here," he said, "to discuss the terms of our arrangement." "I know," she said. "I was early. Would you like your chair back?" She stood before he could answer and moved to the chair on the other side of the desk with the comfortable ease of someone who simply preferred a different seat anyway. Julian sat down, relocated the brass lion to its correct position, and found the list he had prepared the night before. "Our marriage," he said, "will be conducted as a formal arrangement. We will appear together at the necessary social events and maintain appropriate public conduct. Beyond that, we will live separately. You will have your own rooms, your own wing, if you prefer. I will not interfere with your time or your pursuits. You will not interfere with mine." He put the list down and looked at her, waiting for the grief. Clara reached into the small bag she had brought with her, a worn leather satchel, the sort of thing a university professor might carry, thoroughly inappropriate for a duke's study, and produced her own folded paper. Julian looked at it. "I also made a list," she said pleasantly. He unfolded it. It was dense, organized into numbered sections, and written in a handwriting that was very small, very even, and extremely legible. He read through it once. Then he read it again. "You want a greenhouse," he said. "A botanical laboratory, technically," Clara said. "The northeast corner of the grounds gets the best southern light. The existing outbuilding can be converted at modest cost. You have estimated the cost. I find vague requests less persuasive than specific ones." She pointed to Section 3. "You will also note that I have absolutely no objection to your current social arrangements, provided they remain private and do not affect my reputation or my work. I am not here to reform you, Your Grace. I am here to satisfy an inheritance clause and get out of range of my mother's matchmaking, which has been ongoing since I was 17 and shows no signs of natural conclusion." Julian looked at her across the desk. She looked back at him with complete steadiness. "You are not upset," he said. "About which part?" "About what you heard last night." Clara considered this for a moment, in the way she considered most things, genuinely, without performance. "I was not pleased," she said. "But upset implies that I had expectations which were violated, and I did not arrive here with many expectations. I arrived because my father signed a contract and the alternative was worse." She paused. "What you said was unkind. I will remember that. But I am more interested in what you do going forward than in what you said in a private moment you assumed I would never hear." Julian had prepared, the previous night, for approximately 14 different versions of this conversation. None of them had included this one. "Section 7, he said, looking back at the list. "The accounting review," Clara said. "Yes. If I am to manage the household, which, according to your own requirements, is part of my role, then I need access to the current estate finances. The grain contracts were not a criticism. They were an observation. There is a difference. You keep making that distinction. Because people keep confusing the two." He leaned back in his chair and studied her. She was plainer than Lady Penelope, that was the objective fact of it. She wore a serviceable grey dress that she had clearly chosen for practicality rather than impression, and her hair was pinned up in a simple arrangement that suggested she had done it herself. But her eyes, which were a very clear, steady brown, watched everything in the room with an attention that Julian found, despite himself, impossible to dismiss. "The greenhouse," he said. "Laboratory," she corrected. "Fine." He picked up his pen. "Northeast corner. I'll have the estate manager look at the outbuilding this week." Clara reached across the desk and moved the brass lion back to the left side of the blotter. Julian looked at the lion. He looked at her. She met his gaze with mild challenge, the corner of her mouth at the very edge of a smile. "The light," she said simply. Julian left the lion where she had put it. He was not sure why. "We are agreed on the terms, then," he said. "Largely," Clara said. "I have a note on Section 9, the Public Appearances Clause. I want advance notice of at least 3 days for any event requiring formal dress. I need time to prepare properly, and I refuse to be presented to society looking as though I was assembled in a hurry." Julian found himself thinking, without any conscious intention, that Clara Montgomery assembled in a hurry was almost certainly still more composed than most women at their careful best. He did not say this. 3 days, he said instead. "Agreed." Clara made a note on her copy of the list. Then she capped her pen, folded the paper neatly, and tucked it back into her satchel with the organized efficiency of a woman who filed everything and lost nothing. "Thank you," she said, standing. "I'll leave you to the correspondence." She paused at the door. The tenant letters, specifically. "The Harwick family, third page down in the stack, need a reply before Thursday. The leak in their granary has been ongoing since last month." She left. Julian sat at his desk for a moment in the quiet she advocated, looking at the brass lion on the left side of his blotter. He moved it back to the right. Then he looked at it there, and thought about what she had said about the light, and moved it back to the left. He picked up the tenant correspondence and found the Harwick letter on the third page, exactly where she had said it would be. Chapter 3. The Countess of Danbury's summer gala was, by common consensus, the most important social event of the London season. Not because of the food, though the food was excellent, and not because of the music, but because of the watching. The Tun had elevated observation to an art form, and the Countess's ballroom was its finest gallery. Every entrance was assessed. Every partner noted. Every gown evaluated with the concentrated attention that other people reserved for parliamentary votes or medical diagnoses. Clara was aware of all of this. She was also aware that she was the primary exhibit. Julian had given her the required 3 days' notice, and Clara had used them with the same methodical focus she applied to plant taxonomy. She had identified the problem, considered the variables, and constructed an answer. The problem was not that she was a country girl making her debut in London society. The problem was that everyone in that ballroom expected her to know she was a country girl making her debut, and to behave accordingly, with apology, with overcorrection, with the particular nervous brightness of someone who is trying too hard. She had decided, simply, not to. She wore a gown of ivory silk so understated that the design itself became the statement, no excessive embellishment, no aggressive display of Julian's money. Just clean, careful tailoring that fit her properly and moved well. Her only jewelry was a pair of pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's. Her hair was arranged with precision and no fuss. She walked through the ballroom doors and felt the room register her. It was not the reaction they had expected. She could feel that in the specific quality of the watching, the recalibration, the upward revision. She had not arrived looking like a curiosity. She had arrived looking like a woman who had taken this event entirely seriously and produced a considered response to it, which was considerably harder to mock. Julian met her at the edge of the room. He was wearing black, immaculately turned out, and he looked at her for a fraction of a second with an expression that was gone before she could fully read it. "The Countess will want to speak with you early," he said. "She controls the primary social narrative in this room. If she approves, the others follow. And if she doesn't, she will," Julian said, with the calm certainty of someone who knew the room very well. "Smile slightly less than you want to. It reads as confidence." Clara glanced at him sideways. "That is actually useful advice." "I am occasionally useful," he said. The Countess, when they found her, was a tall woman in her 60s who had the posture of someone who had spent 50 years refusing to be diminished. She looked Clara over with the same unambiguous assessment that Clara had learned to use on specimens, thorough, honest, without cruelty. "So you are the cottage botanist who caught Penrose," the Countess said. "I was caught more than I did the catching," Clara said. "But I am making the best of the situation." The Countess laughed, a real, unpretentious sound. "I like her," she said to Julian, in the tone of someone announcing a verdict. "Don't ruin it." Lady Penelope appeared during the second interval. She was wearing emerald, brilliantly, and she moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago learned exactly how much space she was entitled to. She stopped beside Clara near the windows, in the slightly angled way that meant she was performing for an audience she had pre-selected. "Your gown is very simple," Lady Penelope said, pleasantly. "I imagine, coming from the countryside, the London modistes must have seemed rather overwhelming." Several women nearby found reasons to remain in their current positions. Clara turned to look at Lady Penelope directly, with the polite, attentive expression she used when a junior researcher presented flawed data. "They were very accommodating, actually," Clara said. "Though I find simplicity requires more skill than ornamentation, anyone can add decoration, but the cut has to be perfect if there is nothing to distract from it." She paused briefly. "I'm sure you know what I mean." You have been managing the Duke's social calendar for some time, I understand. That must have been such useful work. It has left me with so much more time to focus on the estates. The women nearby did not laugh outright. But there was a collective intake of breath that was, in its own way, more satisfying. Lady Penelope looked at her with an expression that contained, beneath the careful surface, something that was almost amusement. Well played, she said, quietly, with the professional respect of one skilled opponent for another. I learned from the best, Clara said, pleasantly. You, specifically. The library. Last week. Lady Penelope smiled a real one, this time, and moved on. Julian appeared at Clara's elbow. That was either very dangerous or very brilliant, he said. Possibly both, Clara said. The Countess is watching, and she is smiling. I think we are all right. Julian looked across the room at the Countess, confirmed this, and then looked back at Clara with the expression she had started to recognize, the one where he was revising something. They are beginning the waltz, he said. I know. He held out his hand. Not the formal, angled gesture of public obligation, but a straightforward offer, his palm up, waiting for her to decide. She took it. The floor cleared somewhat as they moved to the center. Clara was a competent dancer. Her mother had insisted on lessons in the determined belief that accomplishment led to marriage, which had proved accurate in the most unexpected way, but she had never danced in a room watching her like this one was. Julian guided her into the turn, and she forgot about the room. It was not that he was a technically exceptional dancer, though he was. It was the quality of his attention. He danced the same way he ran a meeting, completely present, tracking every small shift, not so much leading as responding in the instant before she needed him to. She had not expected that. His hand was firm at her waist. His eyes stayed on hers. The distance the waltz required was, all at once, a distance that felt different from the deliberate space they had been maintaining for 3 weeks, not freedom but constraint, and she was noticing it. You are not enjoying this, Julian said quietly. I am enjoying it more than I expected to, Clara said, which was more honest than she had intended. Something moved in his expression. Not the surface control that stayed in place, smooth and composed, but underneath it, briefly and without his permission. The contract, he said, and stopped. The contract, she prompted. It does not say, he said carefully, his voice low enough that only she could hear, anything about the waltz. Clara felt her chest do something she had not authorized it to do. She kept her expression steady through the same discipline she used for fieldwork in difficult conditions. No, she said, just as quietly. It doesn't. The music ended. They stood still for a fraction of a second longer than the dance required, which was enough for the watching room to notice. Clara stepped back. She found, to her very mild irritation, that she had to decide to do it. Chapter 4. The rain began on a Thursday evening and did not stop. Clara had been in her wing of the estate for 2 weeks by then, which were, she reflected, 2 of the more peculiar weeks of her life. The wedding itself had been small and efficient. Julian had managed it like a logistical exercise, which Clara had found simultaneously useful and slightly depressing, and they had retired to Penrose Park under the terms of their contract, adjacent wings, separate schedules, polite acknowledgement in the corridors. It was working. She had her laboratory. Julian had had the outbuilding converted with a speed that suggested he had assigned someone the task immediately after their study meeting, and her research was progressing well. He had his estate matters, his London visits, his life that was mostly separate from hers. The arrangement was exactly what they had both agreed to. She was finding it increasingly difficult to feel satisfied with it. This was inconvenient. She had not come to Penrose Park to develop feelings. She had come to satisfy a contract and secure her independence, and instead she was sitting in her laboratory at 10 in the evening listening to rain on the glass roof and thinking about the waltz. The leak appeared at 10:30. It was not a small leak. A crack somewhere in the east wall of her wing channeled a substantial quantity of water directly into the ceiling above her bedroom, which she discovered when she returned from the laboratory and found her bed receiving a methodical, enthusiastic soaking. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching this, and made a practical assessment. She gathered her book, her notebook, a blanket, and her half-finished glass of wine, and went to find somewhere dry. The only room with a fire still burning at this hour, according to the housekeeper's schedule that Clara had memorized in her first week for exactly these kinds of logistical situations, was Julian's private library. She hesitated at the door. Then the ceiling behind her emitted an ominous creak, and she opened it. Julian was there, at the desk, reading. He looked up when she came in. His eyes moved from her face to the blanket over her arm to the wine glass in her hand, and arrived at a rapid and accurate conclusion. "The east wall leak," he said. "The east wall leak," she confirmed. He gestured, without ceremony, at the armchair near the fire. Clara sat in it, tucked the blanket around her legs, and opened her book. Julian looked at her for another moment, then looked back at his own reading. For 20 minutes, they did not speak. The rain continued without apology. "There is another bottle in the cabinet by the window," Julian said eventually, without looking up. Clara looked at her nearly empty glass. "Thank you." She retrieved it. She poured one glass for herself and, after a moment's consideration, a second, which she set on the corner of his desk without comment. He looked at it, and then at her, and then picked it up. The fire settled lower. The rain changed register, from sharp and driven to the slower, heavier sound of a storm that had decided to stay for a while. "My father," Julian said, into the comfortable silence between them, believed that the Penrose title was the most important thing in England. Clara looked up from her book. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fire, with the expression of a man who had decided to say something he had not said before. "He spent my entire childhood making that case," Julian continued. "Every decision, every relationship, every conversation existed in service of the legacy. You were assessed for your value to it. If you were useful, you were welcome. If you weren't," he stopped. "I learned very early that the title was secure and people were not. So I invested accordingly." Clara set her book down. "The inheritance clause," she said. "His final performance," Julian said, and the bitterness in it was controlled but real. "Even from the grave, managing outcomes. Deciding who I was allowed to be." He looked at the glass in his hand. Lady Penelope was, he paused, choosing the word. Uncomplicated. She wanted what she could get from the association, I wanted the company, and nobody expected anything beyond that. It was clean. "And I was meant to be equally clean," Clara said. "Not with hurt, just understanding," aloud. "You were meant to be a signature on a document," Julian said. He looked at her then, directly, and his voice had changed. "You were not meant to rearrange my desk or correct my contracts or tell the Countess of Danbury that you were making the best of the situation, or," he stopped again. "Or what?" Clara said. The fire cracked. Rain moved across the windows in long, sweeping sheets. "Or make me think," Julian said quietly, "that I have been managing the wrong things for a very long time." Clara looked at him in the low, warm light. This was the second time she had seen beneath the architecture of him. The first had been in the gala, in the waltz, in that fraction of a second, and it was harder to look at than the surface, because the surface was composed and this was not. "I did not come here to manage you," she said. "I know." He shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "That is possibly the most alarming thing about you." She almost laughed. "Clara." He said her name the way he had said it once before, without the title, and she felt the same small interior disruption it had caused the first time. "What if the dowry doesn't matter anymore?" He held her gaze. "What if I want the wife?" The fire had burned very low. The wine was nearly gone. The rain outside was the only sound in the world. Clara was aware of the space between them as a specific, measured thing. She was aware of his hand on the arm of the chair, close enough that shifting slightly in any direction would change something. She was aware that this was the moment the contract had never accounted for. She was also aware, precisely, of the door opening. It opened with considerable drama. Footmen, in Clara's experience, tended to underestimate the weight of doors when they were moving urgently, and a young man in slightly disheveled livery appeared in the frame, visibly out of breath. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Julian with the controlled panic of a man delivering information he would rather not. "The Dowager Duchess has arrived. She is in the entrance hall. She says she intends to stay." Julian sat back. His expression closed over with the swift completeness of shutters in a storm. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, unfinished and suspended, was everything that had just been said in this room. She folded her blanket neatly over her arm, picked up her empty glass, and stood. "I will need 10 minutes, she said. Chapter 5. The Dowager Duchess of Penrose was the kind of woman who filled a room by entering it. She was small, which was the first surprise. Clara had been imagining something taller, built on the scale of the impression she made, but she carried herself with the upright, absolute authority of someone who had decided decades ago that she would not be ignored, and had simply never revisited the question. Her hair was silver, her dress was impeccable, and her eyes, which were the same dark shade as Julian's, moved around the entrance hall with the systematic assessment of a general reviewing uncertain terrain. They found Clara. Clara stood her ground and met the gaze directly. "So this is the botanist," the Dowager said. "Clara Montgomery, Your Grace," Clara said. "Now Vance, technically." "Technically," the Dowager repeated, giving the word the full weight of her skepticism. She looked at Julian. "You look like you have been sitting by a fire drinking wine at midnight. During your first month of marriage." "The East Wing has a leak," Julian said. "I was not aware married couples discussed leaks in separate rooms," the Dowager said. "We have a practical arrangement," Clara said pleasantly. The Dowager turned the full attention of her gaze back to Clara. It was, Clara thought, a genuinely formidable gaze, the kind built by a lifetime of refusing to look away from things first. "I am aware of your arrangement," she said. "I am here to determine whether it satisfies the terms of my late husband's inheritance clause. The clause requires a genuine marriage. I have received reports suggesting," she paused, "that this may be rather more of a business contract than a marriage." Julian stepped forward. "Mother, I can speak for our marriage," Clara said. Julian stopped. The Dowager raised an eyebrow. Clara folded her hands in front of her, took a breath, and spoke with the focused clarity she used for academic presentations, organized, direct, and without any of the nervous softening that she knew the Dowager was testing for. "The clause requires a marriage contracted with a woman of gentry blood, solemnized by the church, and maintained in good standing," she said. "We satisfy all 3 requirements. Our arrangement, practical, organized, respectful, is not the loveless transaction it has been described as. It is a marriage between 2 adults who chose each other consciously and honestly, rather than through performance and pretense." She paused. "I would also note that the legal terms of the inheritance clause do not require that Julian love me in a way that meets your particular specifications. They require that he be married." "He is married." The Dowager regarded her. "You are quite direct," she said. "I have been told that," Clara said. "I find it more efficient than the alternative. The estate finances," the Dowager said, shifting tack with the readiness of someone looking for a weaker wall. "Julian has always been careless about the tenant correspondence." "The tenant correspondence is now current," Clara said. "The grain purchasing contracts are being renegotiated. The northeast outbuilding has been converted to a productive use." She met the Dowager's eyes. "I am not careless with things that matter." Something shifted in the older woman's face. Not warmth, not yet, but the specific quality of reappraisal. The Dowager looked at her son. "She did not require your defense," she said, almost wondering. "No," Julian said. His voice was very quiet. "She has not required it once." The Dowager was silent for a long moment. Clara held still, the way she held still in the laboratory when an experiment was at a critical point and interference would ruin it. Then the Dowager said, "The East Wing leak should have been addressed in October. Speak to the estate manager tomorrow morning." She looked at Clara once more, with an expression that was still assessing but had lost its aggression. "You are not what I expected." "I rarely am," Clara said. The Dowager turned and allowed the waiting footman to lead her toward the guest wing. She did not look back. Julian and Clara stood in the entrance hall in the silence she left behind. The rain was still audible, steadier now, the storm settling into its long, unhurried rhythm. The candles in the hallway brackets were burning low, and the light was the soft, ambiguous kind that made everything slightly easier to say. Julian turned to face her. "You defended me," he said. "It was in the contract," Clara said. Section 4, Paragraph 2. She paused. Her voice, she was aware, was doing something she had not instructed it to do, a slight, involuntary unevenness that she could not correct in time. Protection from overbearing mothers. Clara. Section 4, she said, also has a clause about. To hell with the contract, he said. She stopped. He crossed the space between them with 3 steps and no hesitation, and when he took her face in his hands this time there was none of the careful restraint of a man managing a situation. His thumbs found her cheekbones. His eyes stayed on hers, asking a question that was also, clearly, an answer. I thought you were a signature on a document, he said, low and direct. I was wrong about that before you were out of the carriage. I have been wrong about almost every assumption I made before you arrived, and I am not accustomed to being wrong, and I find that I don't mind it. Not when the alternative is being right and empty. Clara looked at him. At the face she had been cataloguing for weeks, the particular line of his jaw, the way his expression worked when something surprised him, the small, rare, genuine smile that she had produced once and thought about since. You moved the brass lion back, she said. He blinked. What? After I left your study. You moved it back to the right side of the blotter. Julian stared at her. You noticed that. I notice everything, she said. It is impossible for me not to. She held his gaze. You moved it back. And then you moved it to the left again. I checked the next morning. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that had nothing controlled in it. The light, he said. The light, she agreed. He kissed her. It was not a careful, provisional kiss. It was the kind that happens when 2 people have been building toward something for longer than they fully admitted, and the last obstacle has finally been cleared, and there is no longer any reasonable argument for restraint. His hands were warm on her face. She reached up and held his wrists, not to stop him but to anchor herself, and kissed him back with the same directness she applied to everything, completely, without apology, without pretending she had not been thinking about this since a waltz at the Countess of Danbury's gala. When they finally drew apart, the hallway was very quiet. The contract, Clara said. I am dissolving the contract, Julian said. You cannot dissolve a contract unilaterally. Then we will renegotiate. I have terms. You always have terms, he said, and the thing she had been watching for weeks was their unreserved, unmanaged, completely real, a smile that arrived without permission and stayed. The laboratory, she said. Yours, he said. Permanently. Full access to the estate finances. Already yours. And, she said, you stop moving the brass lion back to the right side of the blotter just to have something to disagree with me about. Julian looked at her. That is extremely observant. I know, she said. The rain moved softly against the windows of Penrose Park, and the candles burned in their brackets, and Clara Vance, born Clara Montgomery, cottage botanist, accidental duchess, woman who had arrived with a lemon tart and no intention of being anybody's transaction, looked at the man who had thought she was merely a dowry, and thought that the best experiments were always the ones that produced entirely unexpected results. Julian took her hand. Not the formal, angled gesture. Just his hand around hers, warm and without ceremony, in the quiet hallway of a house that was beginning, slowly and unexpectedly, to feel less like a legacy and more like a life.